Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with the crazy shows that used to happen in the Roman Colosseum. A place where fairness was optional, lions were hungry, and subtlety was thrown into the arena alongside prisoners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the bright lights. You could turn on a fan for a soft background hum. Let's start tonight's journey slowly. The Roman Colosseum wasn't built for sports. It was designed to be a show and also possibly as a way for emperors to avoid doing paperwork. Today, we have stadiums for soccer. The Romans had stadiums for chaos. If you went to the Colosseum expecting fairness, you'd be very disappointed. The crowd wasn't looking for balance. They weren't here to see who fought best. They were here to see who would fall over best, ideally in the most dramatic way possible. Do your best to make it look as funny as possible by moving your arms around a lot and making a sad face. Let's be honest, the Roman idea of entertainment was strong. It's a really even fight between two trained gladiators. Yes, that happened, but there were many more opening acts. People who have committed crimes, people who are being held prisoner, or people who are just very unlucky and happen to owe money to the wrong senator. These people were given a sharp spoon and told to make it dramatic. They made it really dramatic. The Colosseum was more than just a stadium. It was a way of helping the community. Life in ancient Rome was often very stressful. There were diseases, food shortages, and sometimes fires. People coped by watching someone else have a really bad day in a controlled environment. It was free too. The emperor paid for the games, which was a very public way of showing that he was pleased. You get grain, a seat, and a view of someone running from an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the buildings made people feel unequal. The emperor had the best seat. The senators were given cushions, but everyone else was given a stone bench and sunstroke. The people in the arena were the ones who mattered. So fairness wasn't the main goal when it was designed. This wasn't a fencing match. This was ancient Rome's version of dinner theater. If your dinner was fried dormice and the play ended with screaming. If you were a participant, your win-loss ratio wasn't measured. People judged you based on how loudly the crowd reacted when you tripped over your own foot and fell straight into a net. There is no better way to show that you are a public servant than by forcing an untrained person to fight a heavily armed professional in front of 50,000 strangers. The Romans had a word for this kind of entertainment. We have game shows and cooking competitions, but they wanted something with slightly more risk and fewer rules. It's time for the gladiator to face off against the amateur. It's a fun tradition where a trained killer goes up against, for example, a baker with a sword or a bureaucrat with a problem. These weren't just mistakes that happened once. These are planned. Sometimes the people helping were volunteers. Sometimes they were criminals, and sometimes they were just people who should have read the small print. Unlike in modern movies, not all gladiators were poor and powerless. Some of them were volunteers, some were famous people, and all of them were highly trained. They lived in schools, had coaches, and were basically professional athletes, except with more armor and fewer advertising deals. Now, imagine one of them fighting someone who learned sword fighting from watching shadows on a wall. The result was easy to predict, which was the whole point. This wasn't a story to keep you on the edge of your seat. This was about the show. The audience didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner, but pretend that the other guy still had a chance of winning. It was like the ancient Romans version of watching a squirrel try to drive a chariot. And for the amateur, there were other options. Option 1 is to survive long enough to be a bit impressive. Option 2 is to survive long enough for the crowd to feel sorry for you. Option 3, get hit so quickly and dramatically that the audience laughs and the emperor nods in approval. If you were particularly charming or dramatic, you might even be forgiven. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially if the underdog was bleeding just the right amount. But most of the time, the result was decided before the match started. The crowd knew it. The fighters knew it. Even a guy sweeping the sand probably knew it. Let's say you're accused of a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Perhaps you stared at the emperor's statue for too long. Maybe your neighbor just really doesn't like you. Well done. You now qualify for a special appearance in the Colosseum. When we say special appearance, what we mean is that you're going to see a lion up close, probably without warning. The damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was a Roman tradition that asked the important question: what if our justice system was also a zoo? It was Rome's solution to everything from theft to treason. Put the accused in the arena, open a gate, play some music, and watch the chaos. The lions weren't ordinary cats either. They were often brought to the country from North Africa and treated like the best of them. They had better transport than most people and sometimes better food. The prisoner, meanwhile, got a tunic and felt worried. They have no armor or weapons, but sometimes they have a stick. It's not fair to give someone a twig and tell them to make it look exciting. This wasn't a fight. It was a message. The empire didn't just punish you. It made you part of the show. The more dramatic your final moments, the more the crowd cheered, the more the emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was overdue. And yes, people brought their children. Why go to the forum when you could teach your kids important life lessons like don't commit fraud or you'll be lunch? Sometimes the condemned surprised everyone. They ran, they dodged, they climbed things. There's a story of a man playing dead so well that the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd didn't. They made sure the show could go ahead. If you think this seems like a lot, the Romans would have agreed. But only if you suggested not using lions, because that would have ruined the way it looks. So, let's say the lion match is over and the crowds have seen enough of unarmed prisoners making friends with fate. What's next? Of course, we should arm some people and send them back in, but with more animals and some strange ones. Imagine a world where Rome's wild animals are not just any ordinary wild animals, but highly annoyed ones. Now, imagine a man wearing gladiator sandals in this world. That's the Venons. These were staged hunts where specially trained fighters, or whoever was available and not too busy, were given weapons and told, try not to look nervous. The Colosseum would be made to look like a fake wilderness. The set could include fake trees, imported sand, and maybe even some shrubs if there was enough money. Then wild animals were released. Leopards, bears, ostriches, rhinos, and crocodiles. Basically, anything that could stomp, charge, or deeply confuse an audience. Fighters were expected to use spears, nets, or sometimes just their hands to fight them. There are stories of men being sent in with slings or sticks, which is as effective as yelling, "Please stop," at a charging boar. And here's the surprising part. It still wasn't a fair fight, just the opposite. Sometimes the animals were sick, given drugs, or started to make things easier. Other times they were just left to their own devices, not knowing if they should attack or be part of a play. But that didn't matter. The goal wasn't to survive. It was amazing. Did the crowd care about the animals? Not really. If a rhino flipped a man into the air like a coin, they cheered. If the man won, they cheered even louder. It was all fun and games, with the animals sometimes working together. One story says that a bear and a lion ignored the humans and started fighting. The crowd loved it. The person who organized it probably got a promotion. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't a fight. It was what happens when a country becomes rich enough to invent new hobbies and bored enough to turn the food chain into improvisational theater. By now, the Roman Colosseum had established a theme. Take something brutal and make it weirder. But when they wanted to really impress the audience, They used stories from mythology. It's better to make someone into a legend than to kill them. This lovely tradition was called fatal charades. It wasn't a game, but a way for the public to watch people being punished in a creative way. Picture a man who has been sentenced to death. He is dressed as Icarus with fake wings, and he is pushed off a platform. No, he didn't fly. No, it wasn't subtle. The Romans loved stories about gods and heroes with sad endings. Instead of dealing with criminals in a calm way, they made their deaths into shows. The audience wasn't just watching justice, they were watching art. Art that is supported by the government and is violent. Take the story of Prometheus, for example. In myth, he's tied to a rock and keeps getting attacked by eagles. At the Colosseum, they skipped the rock and used stage props. But the eagle was real. Orpheus was a musician who tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. He was a tragic figure. A man in a tunic with a harp is walking across the arena. And then someone quietly releases a few large, extremely uninterested animals. It didn't end with music. The crowd loved it, of course. At last, everything you need for culture and entertainment in one place. You could feel superior for realizing the myth, and still point and laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his sandals. Were these performances based on the original stories? Not at all. But accuracy wasn't the goal. It was a spectacle. If they remembered the plot, that would be great. If not, they just invented a new version where Hercules loses a foot. To be clear, these weren't plays. The performers weren't actors. They were people who'd been sentenced to death and were now expected to help make a story real before leaving it at the end. There was no curtain call or applause at the end, just the emperor nodding and the crowd, who had just seen someone get executed, feeling a little more cultured. You might think the Colosseum couldn't get any more amazing, but Rome had another idea. What if we turned it into a lake? Yes. At different times in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock sea battles called machi. Because if you've already made executions into a show, the next step is to pretend there's a maritime war in a building that's not near the sea at all. Roman engineers, who were very talented and had a lot of free time, figured out how to flood the arena floor with water. They didn't just do it for show. They really flooded the arena with water strong enough to make boats float and panic any inexperienced sailors who tried to cross it. The plan was simple: fill the floor, throw in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who often knew less about rowing than the audience. Sometimes, these pretend battles show the famous sea battles that have happened in the past. Other times, it was just teams of captives told, row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen it or before. And let's talk about those boats. They were smaller than real warships, of course. Try putting a full fleet into an amphitheater and see what happens. But they were still wearing paint, flags, and real weapons, which meant there was a good chance that someone was going to fall in or be pushed in or just jump in because it seemed like the better option. The audience watched from above, just like cruise passengers watching a buffet fire, equally confused and delighted. No one really cared about the tactics used at sea. They wanted to see if someone fell off the boat in a dramatic way. It would be even better if they shouted something poetic while they were doing it. And yes, there were some dramatic moments. Ships collide, fighters leap across decks, and people accidentally poke their allies with spears. To be honest, it was more like a chaotic mess with costumes than naval strategy. In the end, the Colosseum stopped flooding itself for these shows. This is probably because water and old concrete don't go well together. But for a while, Romans got their sea battles, their splashing, and their laughs. Even if half the people taking part couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer. Sometimes, even stage combat wasn't dramatic enough. That's when the people in charge brought out the party pack. This included blindfolds, handcuffs, weapons that didn't match, and things that just didn't make sense. Why? Because being fair is boring. But watching someone try to fight blindfolded is funny, except for the person wearing the blindfold. One popular way to make a fighter more interesting was to make their life harder. This could mean taking away their armor, shortening their weapon, or giving them something useless like a net or, even worse, a wooden sword. There's nothing like stepping into the arena with what looks like a toy stick. Then there were the chains. Fighters were sometimes chained by the ankles, wrists, or both. If you've already practiced surviving an armed duel in front of thousands, what you really need is to be physically restrained while doing it. Bonus, it makes it so that people have to think about how to use it. Some of them had to fight while tied together. Yes, to each other. It was called the three-legged race of doom. Okay, it wasn't officially, but it should have been. Try to imagine how hard it would be to survive if you had to move around based on what someone else was doing. One person trips, both people fall over, and the crowd goes wild. Obviously, these tricks weren't used on everyone. Gladiators were investments. The ones who attracted the most attention and had good reputations were the ones who were spared the most ridiculous setups, unless the audience was bored and the emperor wanted to laugh. Then it was all up for grabs. And sometimes there's an unexpected opponent too. You think you're fighting one guy, but then something unexpected happens. A trapdoor opens and a second guy appears, or even something with claws. Picture a WWE match where the floor suddenly throws out a bear. Ancient Rome did that, but they really meant it. None of this was in the rule book because there wasn't a rule book. There was just a checklist. Is it entertaining? Is it ridiculous? Can it be cleaned before the next match? You might think that the Roman Colosseum, with all its chaos and brilliance, gave its audience a break between events. Take a moment to stretch, get some olives, and chat about how well the gladiators' accessories suited them. And actually, there was a break in the middle. But in true Roman fashion, even that was made into a show. Welcome to the Meridiani, the midday break. In the morning, there were hunts, and in the afternoon, there were gladiator duels. But it was public executions at lunchtime, because in the empire, the idea of due process is a perfect match for your midday bread roll. These executions weren't random. Everything was planned in advance, and the timing was exact, like a theater performance. People who were going to be executed, usually criminals, people who had left the army, or people who had annoyed a government official, were brought out for the crowd to see. This was to show that justice was being served. It was done in a public and simple way, without any complicated official procedures. No one thought there would be any drama. This wasn't a fight. It was a warning. Don't be like this guy, the empire said. Also, please enjoy your olives. The methods were creative. Sometimes it was quick, a clean finish, and on with the show. Other times, it was overly complicated, especially if the person had been in the news. The Romans believed that justice should be quick, dramatic, and it would be even better if it was sponsored by someone in a toga, a Roman tunic. The crowd had become used to it by this point. Kids asked for better seats. Merchants sold snacks. No one noticed. If anything, they got annoyed when it went on for too long. Come on, someone would say quietly. We're just here for the real matches. That's what makes this part so ridiculous. For the audience, the executions were just filler content, like commercials. Instead of advertising soap, they demonstrated why you shouldn't steal one. If that feels strange, that's the point. The Colosseum was more than just an arena. It was a carefully planned performance of control. Everything was done to remind the public who had the power and what would happen if they challenged it. This was true for every moment, including the break in the middle. In modern sports, it is the job of the referee to make the decisions. In the Roman Colosseum, the crowd made up the jury. They had eaten too much bread and were probably drunk. Yes, in Rome, justice was decided by the people. After a gladiator match, the person who lost didn't always die right away. If he fought well, or at least showed enthusiasm, the final decision was up to the audience. Would he live to fight another day, or become a warning for how not to move in the future? Then put your thumbs in. You might have heard of the famous thumbs down sign, meaning death. But there's a twist in the plot. Historians don't know for sure what each thumb meant. Some sources say that a thumbs up meant execution, like a sword being drawn. Others say that the thumbs down sign meant she should show mercy. Some people say that the gestures weren't about thumbs at all. They think they were more like vague hand movements. This made gladiators wish that Romans had just invented scorecards. Either way, the audience's reaction mattered, and they were not shy. They came to the Colosseum ready to cheer, boo, and yell at people who were literally fighting for their lives. It was like an old version of Yelp, but with more tunics and fewer stars. If a fighter was boring, he might get booed, which is the worst possible outcome. If he was exciting, the crowd would cheer for mercy or punishment, or both. It was a little unclear, but very loud. Some gladiators tried to win favor. They played to the stands. They had fans. Yes, I'm talking about real fan bases. Some of the fighters were famous enough to have their own names and even their own merchandise. Okay, they weren't official merchandise, but people wore carvings of them. It's the same idea. If the emperor was there, things would get political really quickly. He could overrule the crowd's vote, showing mercy or ordering their execution. Either way, he could see what everyone was thinking, like a comedian, but with more serious consequences and fewer jokes. Well, it depends on the emperor. So, while the games looked chaotic, they were actually pretty democratic, at least for the fighters. If you entertained, you had a chance. If you didn't, the crowd was ready to vote with their voices, their hands, and occasionally their sandwiches. Survival in the Colosseum wasn't just about being skilled. The idea was to put on a good show and hope that people would be feeling generous. You might expect to see lions, tigers, and the guy with the net at the Roman Colosseum, but wild boars probably wouldn't be top of your list. But in ancient Rome, pigs weren't just food. They were part of the entertainment, and not in a cute farm-petting zoo kind of way. Wild boars were dangerous. These were strong, tusk-wielding creatures that lived in the forest and used their hooves as battering rams. Imagine their angry bowling balls in nature with more speed and force. Now imagine one of them charging at you in front of a crowd of people cheering. You try to look brave in a leather skirt. Gladiators were trained for many things, but they were not trained to fight pigs. Sometimes boars were used in animal hunts. Horses were released into the arena for the fighters to ride and kill with spears. Sometimes, to make things more exciting, the bow were brought into the fight as a surprise. Nothing made a duel more exciting than a 300 pounds pig running across the stage without being asked to. In at least one event, records describe an animal so aggressive that it charged through props, ignored its handler, and nearly ran into the front row. The Romans loved it. Airborne pork is a great way to show that public funding is working well. And if you're wondering how this counts as entertainment for the Roman crowd, it's because the point is that you never know what's going to happen next. A lion was majestic. A tiger was scary. A boar was really funny, especially when someone didn't take it seriously. Even emperors got involved. Some of these hunts were organized to show off the exotic animals that people had collected, including very aggressive pigs, to show how well-stocked their empire was in both bacon and courage. The fighters, meanwhile, were mostly just trying to survive. You could learn to defend against the sword. You might see a human, but a wild boar is more likely. That was pure chaos in pig form, with tusks that turned kneecaps into hazards. And in the grand tradition of Roman entertainment, nobody asked whether we should be doing this. They just asked if it was possible to add another boar to the scene. Here's a spoiler. They could, and they often did. The arena floor was not just a normal stretch of sand. Under the ground, there was a maze of tunnels, cages, lifts, and pulleys. Everything has been carefully planned to ruin someone's afternoon. These amazing machines allowed stagehands to move animals, props, or sometimes whole sets into the arena at exactly the right time. You're a gladiator in the middle of a fight, sweating under the Roman sun. And just as you're about to win, the floor opens and out comes a leopard. This is not part of the match. It is just extra content. This was not an accident. People who planned events in ancient Rome love surprises. Why have a normal jewel when you could turn it into an obstacle course with hidden lions? And it wasn't just animals. Sometimes chariots would roll out, sometimes fire pits, and sometimes large wooden structures meant to represent mythological backdrops like the underworld or a volcano. It's all designed to keep the crowd interested and the participants very confused. It turned combat into theater and theater into absolute chaos. You didn't just fight your opponent. You fought the floor, the props, and your growing suspicion that someone behind the scenes was laughing very hard. These trapdoors were operated by teams of slaves and workers who worked under the stage. They coordinated their movements with great precision, like a military operation or a slightly chaotic circus. If one of the levers was pressed incorrectly, a bear would suddenly appear in a wrong scene, or worse, it might not appear at all. This meant that for 20 minutes, the audience would see two fighters fighting each other. This was exciting for the fighters, but it also taught them humility and made them aware of their ankles. In the Colosseum, you weren't just facing your opponent. You were facing the architecture, stage design, and the Roman Empire's deep commitment to surprising people with unpleasant things. If the gods truly favored the brave, then they also appreciated those who managed not to fall through a trapdoor while posing for a victory. At first, gladiator versus gladiator matches sound like the fairest part of the Colosseum schedule. Two trained professionals, equally matched, are facing each other in front of a lively crowd. It's like an ancient UFC fight, but with better-looking outfits. But of course, this is Rome, and fairness was not a priority. While some bouts were evenly matched, making them exciting for the crowd and easy to watch, many others were fixed before they even started. One fighter might be a very experienced veteran who has fought in the arena many times. The other, a rookie who is just finding out about the sword. And don't get too attached to the idea of standard weapons either. Sometimes one fighter got a gladius, a type of sword, and a shield. The other got a net and a trident. It wasn't because it made tactical sense, but because the crowd liked variety and someone in event planning had a talent for chaos. These strange combinations had names. The man with the spear was especially popular. One had armor, a big helmet and traditional gear. The other one wore almost nothing, carried a special fork for eating fish, and tried to avoid being hit. It was more like a contest between two very different speeds. Can Speedy McBareFeet avoid being flattened? Why are there mismatches? Because Rome loved contrast. It was boring to see two fighters with the same weapons. But imagine you have a big, armored tank against a thin, almost naked rope flinger. That's entertainment. If one gladiator had more fans or a sponsor who wanted to win, the match might be more likely to go their way. He didn't do it to prove himself. He did it to look cool and win. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were investments, and they were well known. If someone had a dramatic win streak or a distinctive fighting style, the empire would take notice. Fans bought figurines. The children acted out their victories. Merchandising wasn't official, but it existed. Sometimes, the fight was stopped so that the story of the fighter who lost could be kept alive. Well, he was either forgettable or unlucky, possibly both. Because in the Colosseum, balance was just an illusion. The audience didn't come for sportsmanship. They came to see someone who was not as good as them and hoped to beat them. And if that person somehow won anyway, now that would be a story. If you thought the Roman Colosseum was just about swords and sand, think again. It was also about spin, but not the kind that happens when someone gets hit really hard and falls over. No, this was about politics. The Colosseum was more than just a place for the people to enjoy. It was a carefully designed public relations campaign that made everyone aware of who was in charge. Every event, every match, every mistake we made when we released 2 tigers was part of a carefully planned message from the Imperial. Obey or else. Executions weren't just punishments. They were just statements. People who had committed crimes or rebelled against the government were made to appear before the public and punished in a very dramatic way. One day, you're in a scroll with a bad opinion. The next day, you're playing the role of a fallen hero in a reenactment of a myth you didn't ask to be part of. The Emperor wasn't just watching, he was staring. He sat in the best seat, right in the middle, in the shade, and close enough to the action to nod thoughtfully when someone got cut off. The crowd watched him as much as the fights. His reactions were important. If he gave a thumbs up, it wasn't just a gesture. It was all over the news. Some emperors used the games to win people's favor. Remember the saying, bread and circuses? If people are fed and distracted, they won't notice the problems with the empire's budget. Others used it to scare people. A public execution here, a surprise lion there. All of these things really motivate people. If you were a popular gladiator, you might even be used as a political pawn. If you fight well, you show that Rome is strong. You didn't want to die properly, and then suddenly you were someone who was a burden to others. Sometimes, events were organized around political stories. They're celebrating a military victory. Great. Let's recreate it in the arena with extra features and real casualties. You are hosting a person of importance from another country. Let's have fun with tigers. Visiting officials are always impressed by people wearing armor who jump over hippos. So yes, the Colosseum was Rome's most violent press conference. Every bit of sand and dramatic collapse was part of the empire's plan to share its message. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, hidden traps, weapons, and political messages. Why did the Colosseum stay open for so long? Easy. Rome loved a good show. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, and a way to bring people together. Sometimes, they were even used as therapy for a society that really needed something to do. The empire was big, complicated, and frequently on fire, sometimes literally. But give the people a gladiator match, and suddenly everything feels stable. The formula worked. A bored, overworked citizen might complain about grain shortages, but give them a seat in the Colosseum, a snack, and a front row view of someone wrestling a panther wearing a wig. Suddenly, life wasn't so bad. That's the basics of building an empire. Distract, dazzle, repeat. Emperors loved it. The games gave them instant approval ratings. Do you want to win the crowd after raising taxes? Host a week-long festival? Accidentally insult the Senate? Release some fire-breathing chariots and tigers? Make a general feel insecure? Have his enemy play the hero in a reenacted myth and forget to tell him it's a metaphor? The Colosseum was the original social media platform with constant updates and drama. It was a place where people's careers were launched, enemies were defeated, and your public image could be defined by a single thumb gesture. There was no room for comments, though. People either clapped or stayed silent, which in Rome was basically a down vote. But even the greatest empires get tired. Over time, the shows became less extravagant. It became harder to import animals, and the audience was less amazed. By the time Rome began to crumble, even the Colosseum started to feel old-fashioned. Sand and stone don't last forever, and neither do people's attention spans. But the effects of this legacy could still be felt. Even today, we remember the Colosseum not as a sports arena, but as a monument to how far a society will go for a good show. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. but it was unforgettable. When you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, subtlety isn't really the aim. You're aiming for history. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Ireland. It's April 30th and the winds are changing direction. You look out over the rolling hills and quietly say to yourself, yes, it's time to set something on fire again. Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival. It was about more than just celebrating the start of summer. It was about surviving it. Today, people might put on sunscreen and complain about the heat, but in the past, your ancestors were busy collecting wood and herding cows around two large bonfires. Why? They believed that the smoke could purify, protect, and maybe even impress the local spirits. In the past, fire was more than just something that was useful. It was a living force, a bridge between worlds. The lighting wasn't casual. It was very important. The druids, the community's spiritual leaders, were responsible for the flames. They would chant and make gestures. Eventually, they would light a big fire called the need fire. All the other fires in the area would be lit from this one. Imagine it as a spiritual reboot, but with way more excitement and less instructions. As the fires burned, villagers would lead their animals, including cows and sheep, through the flames. It might sound a bit extreme, but this was a way of protecting against disease and bad luck. Want your cattle to stay healthy and produce milk? March them through fire. Want to stay fertile? Take a leap of faith over the flames. Mild singing is the perfect way to show your love for someone. And of course, there was dancing, naked or clothed, depending on the year and how much I was involved. Couples might jump the flames together to symbolize their love, while single dancers hoped to encourage a divine matchmaker to play favorites. Beltane was more than just a festival. It was a way of marking the change in the seasons, a fiery handshake between people and the other world. When the fires died down, the embers were scattered in the fields, spreading the blessing of flame across the land. Now, let's leave the wet hills of Celtic lands and cross into the hot, dry heart of ancient Persia. Here, fire was a serious business. It was a powerful presence, like a divine force that needed to be respected and honored. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest religions that believe in only one God. In this religion, fire was not just sacred, it was seen as the very truth itself. They called it Adder, a living symbol of Asher, the divine order of the universe. This meant that fire was more than just a useful thing to have in the kitchen. It was a perfect example of how things in space should be balanced. So, there's no pressure. The most important part of the worship was the fire temple. Their priests, known as Meds, looked after flames that had been burning for years, sometimes for centuries. Imagine them as divine cleaners wearing robes. They have extinguishers, but they also have bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers to gently fan the flames. The idea was that this flame had to be kept alive, unbroken, pure, and undisturbed. It was not to be allowed to go out. That was basically a major mistake in the universe, a divine error of epic proportions. These fire rituals weren't just for one god either. During the big festivals like Sad and Shahashan Bayuri, whole communities would light bonfires in public squares to celebrate creation, rebirth, and the ever-ongoing battle between light and darkness. People would jump over the fires while chanting things like, "Give me your red color. Take away my sickly pallor," which, let's be honest, is basically the ancient Persian version of New Year, New Me. Sparks weren't just a symbol of passion. The fire was like a messenger, carrying prayers to the heavens and keeping demons and bad luck away. Funeral rites were even in place to stop flames from touching the dead. Why? This is because it would pollute it. Fire needed to stay pure and free from judgment, like a therapist who has seen everything but never says a word. In the Persian view, fire was not something that could be controlled. It was a special connection that linked people to the divine plan of the universe. It's a warm, flickering flame, but it also reminds you to take care of your soul and your motivation. We move straight on to ancient Greece, where fire festivals were more than just religious ceremonies. They were full-on athletic competitions. When the Greeks honored the gods, they didn't just pray. They sprinted with fire. The torch race, or lampodromia, was the event that everyone knew about. Imagine a special race where runners carried lit torches like flags through Athens. The goal wasn't just to be fast. It was to keep the flame alive. If you dropped your torch or it went out, you're out of the running. Well done. You failed both your city and the divine. These races were held to honor gods associated with fire and knowledge. Hestus was the god of fire. Prometheus was a rebellious titan who stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity. This bold move made him the target of eternal teasing from Zeus, which in Greek mythology is like a light slap on the wrist. The torch race wasn't just a competition. It was like a ritual theater performance. By keeping the flame burning, runners symbolized the idea that divine wisdom, which is passed down to mortals, is eternal. It wasn't enough to have the courage. You had to show that you could carry it without dropping it, like a clumsy apprentice in Hephaestus' workshop. This wasn't just a quick run through the olive groves. The races were often held at night. The only light came from torches that were held aloft, casting shadows on temples and columns and causing some animals to run around in a state of confusion. The way it looked was on purpose. The gods are watching, so you better make it look amazing. There were also deeper symbolic layers. When Prometheus gave fire to humanity, it wasn't just about making things warmer or easier to cook. It stood for intelligence, change, and resistance. When the Greeks honored him with torch races, they weren't just reenacting a myth. They were quietly reminding themselves that they had been clever and rebellious, and had been trying to become civilized, even if it had cost them dearly. The winners got a crown or a small statue, or maybe even a jar of olive oil, because after all, this is Greece. But the real prize was glory and maybe a temporary break from angry gods destroying your crops. Next time you see a modern Olympic torch relay, remember that it's about more than just sport. It's a reminder of the Greek love of fire, of rebelling against the universe, and of running so fast that you could catch fire. We started with the Greek torch relays, and now we're moving on to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from the gods. It was the god. Meet Agni, the Hindu god of fire. He was not just a deity of warmth and light, but also a cosmic postman. His role is to take offerings from earth to heaven through fire, and he always does this in a reliable way. There have been no lost packages and no problems with the customer service line. In Vedic rituals, the sacred ceremonies of ancient India, Agi was the connection between humans and gods. Any prayer worth its salt needed fire, and not just any fire. It had to be lit properly and fed with clarified butter and ghee. Basically, it's the most important part of every ritual and is accompanied by mantras. These are called yajnas. They were so important that priests spent their whole lives learning them. Imagine a spiritual firework display, but with way more incense and way fewer insurance claims. In a typical yajna, a sacred fire pit called a havan kund was constructed, often in intricate geometric patterns aligned with celestial forces. The fire had to be made to burn using friction or luck, with no matches or lighter. When it was lit, the sky became bright. You weren't just watching a fire. You were looking into the eyes of God. But this wasn't a one-time thing. The most religious households kept eternal fires burning, flames that never went out, passed down from one generation to the next. If a fire died, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a spiritual emergency. Some people even thought it could disrupt the natural balance of the universe. Imagine you accidentally spill water on a divine flame. Oops, doesn't quite cover it. Fire festivals like Lori and Mackay later evolved into seasonal celebrations. These celebrations were for marking the changing seasons. They included bonfires, songs, and offerings. It was like a joyful cloud of smoke, like a purification dance with sparks flying. And unlike with some traditions where fire was kept away from, here it was close, real, and respected a lot. Ag wasn't feared like a wildfire. He was honored like an ancestor, a witness to every vow, every birth, every death. In ancient India, fire was seen as a divine messenger. In ancient Egypt, it was seen as the very breath of the sun, God himself. Fire here was more than just a little flame. It was the sun god Ra, who rode across the sky in a fiery chariot. And every night he fought off a chaos serpent in the underworld, powered entirely by radiant celestial fire. No pressure, Ra. But let's take a closer look at the human rituals. While Ra traveled to work using solar energy, the Egyptians celebrated with fire as well. People didn't use fire to keep warm. It was a symbol of purification, protection, and rebirth. Temples were built to catch the morning sun in their darkest parts, as if the gods themselves were turning on the lights. The most famous fire ritual was the Feast of Opet, also known as the Weep Renet Festival. This was when the new year was celebrated. It wasn't your typical countdown and fireworks situation. It was a multi-day spectacle featuring priests, incense, offerings, and most importantly, ceremonial torches carried in processions. These weren't just for show. The fire was a symbol of Ra's new energy coming back to Earth, keeping away darkness and illness. It was like spiritual pest control, but with fireworks. Fire was an important part of the plan, but it was also controlled carefully. Egyptians didn't cremate. They didn't like that, but they burned incense and special oils during burial rites. People believed that the smoke rising from the offerings would carry the soul's essence up into the afterlife. And if the gods liked the smell, even better. Priests also kept fires burning in temples, especially in those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess you really didn't want to upset. Her festivals included fire rituals to appease her destructive nature. And yes, sometimes they involved beardy red to look like blood because Egyptian gods loved symbolism and a bit of mildly theatrical drama. The fire in Egypt wasn't chaotic. It was neat like the sky and bright. It came with scrolls, hymns, and complex schedules. Every spark had a script. Now we're going to explore the jungles and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where fire was more than just a symbol of life. It was the engine of the universe. To keep that engine running, you need more than just candles and kind thoughts. For the Aztecs, Maya, and Zapotecs, fire was a sacred force that governed time, farming, and even human fate. But they didn't just organize ordinary festivals. They had cundical fire resets. Go to the new fire ceremony, which is held every 52 years. This is when the Aztec calendar completes its sacred cycle. It's like a cosmic version of the Y2K crisis, but with higher stakes and fewer IT professionals to deal with it. As the big day got closer, everyone put out all the fires in their homes. Cities went dark. People destroyed their belongings. They didn't eat, prayed, and basically thought the world might end. Then, at midnight, priests climbed a holy hill and sacrificed their hearts. Only after the heart was burned and the new flame kindled on the chest cavity, yes, really, was the fire declared reborn. This one divine spark would ignite every household flame across the empire. Fire was seen as a symbol of rebirth, continuity, and the forces of nature. If the fire didn't start, the sun might not come out again. Don't worry. In Maya civilization, fire was also very important in temple dedications and royal rituals. Newly built temples were set on fire. They would literally burn offerings in the main chamber to activate the structure, as if inviting divine entities to move in. And if you were a king, your rise to power required certain rituals, including the burning of incense and sometimes the shedding of blood to show that you meant it. The Zapotecs were equally committed. Their fire god, Koyo, was closely tied to storms and lightning. Festivals in his honor included bonfires, dances, and occasionally the dramatic burning of symbolic figures, sort of a divine piñata with a flammable personality. In all these cultures, fire was a way of communicating with the gods, but it was also a demand. It was hungry and needed food. This is not just about using logs or copal resin, but about making sacrifices. The smoke didn't just rise up, it was like it was trying to tell me something. Now we will sail into the huge Pacific Ocean, where there are lots of islands that look like stepping stones made of fire. For ancient Polynesians, fire was not just something that was useful. It was a story about where they came from, a gift from gods who lived in the mountains. Many Polynesian cultures believe in a goddess called Pele. She is the spirit of volcanoes and is particularly important in Hawaiian mythology. She wasn't a calm goddess of the hearth, gently tending your cooking pot. She was a force of nature. She created islands with her lava, then destroyed them in a fit of rage. In this culture, respecting fire was very important. It was a matter of survival. Pele was said to live in the Halima Amau crater at the top of Colosseum, one of the most active volcanoes in the world. When it happened, it wasn't a natural disaster. She was pale and didn't say much. Lava flows were seen as her fiery footsteps, reshaping the land according to divine will. People left offerings near craters, flowers, food, and chants. Sometimes they left hair or nails, too. It's important to stay on a goddess's good side when she is literally changing the landscape. Fire festivals in Polynesia took many forms, but one of the most amazing was the Saafi, or fire knife dance. It is still performed in places like Samoa and Tonga. Originally, this dance was part of warrior rituals. It involved spinning flaming knives while jumping, flipping, and doing things that defy common sense. It wasn't just about looking good. It was a deep spiritual performance. The fire knife was seen as a symbol of inner strength and a connection to ancestral power. In everyday life, Polynesians used fire for three things: to cook in special earth ovens called omu, to light paths during ceremonies, and to communicate with the spirit world. Fire was the connection between what we can see and what we can't, the physical world and the spiritual world. Even funeral rites involved sacred torches and chants, guiding the soul of the dead person toward the ancestral realms across the sea. Some people on the island thought that their ancestors' spirits traveled on fire, as seen in the flickering of torches or the glow of fireflies. If you ignored or mishandled fire, you might offend the gods and ghosts. You might think that the very cold lands of ancient Scandinavia would be too cold and wet for fiery rituals. But the Norse had a special relationship with fire. In a land with icy fjords and long winters, fire was more than just a way to stay warm. It was a matter of survival, both physical and spiritual. At the center of Norse mythology is a duality between fire and ice. The world was created when the realms of fire and frost clashed. When the two of them collided in the empty space of Ginnungagap, sparks flew. And out of that chaos came the first being, Ymir, and eventually the gods. Fire was very important. It was both a creator and a destroyer. The Norse believed that Surta was the most fearsome fire figure in their mythology. He was a fire giant from Muslim who, according to prophecy, would ride out during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, with a flaming sword in hand. His mission: to burn the world to the ground. You can see that fire was a serious matter. People also celebrated fire festivals to mark the changing seasons, especially the end of winter and the return of the sun. Celebrations like Yule, which later merged with Christmas, were all about fire. Large fires burned for days. Hello, Yule, representing the rebirth of the sun. The longer it burned, the better your luck for the coming year. Lighting the Yule fire wasn't just a way to feel warm and cozy. It was also a way to feel connected to the universe. Bonfires were also lit during midsummer festivals where the light was at its peak and spirits roamed more freely. Leaping over flames, a practice shared with other cultures, was believed to protect you, make you more fertile, and possibly impress your crush. And when it came to death, fire had the final say. Viking funerals weren't just longboats and slow-motion archery. Yes, cremation was common. It was believed that the soul of the dead person was released to Valhalla or Folkvanger, the afterlife realms of warriors and the chosen, by fire. The fire made things clean, good, and important. It was a mix of goodbye, change, and showy action. In the past, fire was seen as something that brought life, but it could also be used to judge people. It could warm your home or destroy your family's money. For many cultures, fire was the ultimate test. It was a tool of divine justice, spiritual purification, and cosmic reckoning. And unlike modern courts, there were no appeals. In ancient India, fire was not just a god, it was also a witness. In the epic Ramayana, Sita, wife of the hero Rama, had to undergo a trial by fire, literally. After being kidnapped and rescued, she walked through flames to prove her purity. The fire, Agi himself, was found not guilty. She was not hurt, and so she was not guilty. It's a complicated mix of gender expectations, but it also shows how fire was seen as the ultimate judge of truth. In medieval and ancient Europe, similar ideas were used in trial by ordeal. People thought to be criminals, witches, or unlucky were sometimes made to take part in fire-based tests. These included holding a red-hot iron or walking across glowing coals. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent. If not, you probably wouldn't want to be there for the closing arguments. These trials were not spiritually uplifting, but they did show that some people still believe that fire could reveal divine will. In Zoroastrianism, one of the first ideas about fire as a sign of judgment came from the idea of the Chinvat Bridge, which is the place where you go after you die. When someone died, their soul would have to cross a very thin bridge above a river of molten metal. Those who had lived righteously would find it as gentle as warm milk. The wicked, let's just say they discovered that divine metal has no chill. Even the Aztecs, who worshiped fire with great devotion, saw it as a cycle. If their new fire ceremony didn't work, the world could end. Fire, which was once a gift from the gods, could also be used to destroy the world. It made humanity modest and a bit dangerous. Throughout all these traditions, fire became a mirror. Whatever you brought to it, truth, guilt, devotion, or fear, it revealed. Fire was the final challenge for the soul, whether it was in sacred rites or terrifying trials. In ancient Egypt, paying taxes was more than just an economic duty. It was almost like a spiritual duty. The Pharaoh was not a typical bureaucrat. He was the divine middleman between gods and humans. So when he demanded tribute, it wasn't seen as exploitation. It was seen as a way of maintaining balance in space. Matt, the sacred order of the universe. It's a good way to keep things in perspective. Money, as we know it, didn't really exist in ancient Egypt. So how did the Pharaoh fill his royal coffers? Grain. There's lots of grain. The Nile's annual flooding made the fields fertile, and after harvest, scribes would arrive to measure how much tax you owed. They used rope, sticks, and something like a calculator made of frustration. If your land produced 10 sacks, you might have to pay the state 3 of them. I can't pay. You might lose your land or your animals. You might even be sent to work for the state. The huge pyramids of Giza weren't built by aliens or slaves. They were partly paid for by taxpayers. If you didn't have enough grain or goods, you could be forced to build public works, carry limestone, dig irrigation canals, or construct the latest shrine to Horus. Well done. You are now part of Egypt's National Infrastructure Initiative. The whole system was recorded in great detail by scribes, the people who were paid to write down information. They documented everything, like how much wheat you owed and whether your donkey was taxable. Yes, even animals could be taxed. If it was moving and had value, the state probably wanted some of it. Egypt's tax system was centralized, efficient, and when needed, brutally enforced, but it was also flexible. During times of famine or bad flooding, tax collectors might reduce how much people had to pay, not because they were being kind, but because dead farmers don't pay taxes. The Romans were the ones who started taxing bodily functions. In the huge marble forums and gladiator games, taxation was both a way of dealing with paperwork and a reason for people to complain. You could be taxed for land, slaves, doors, and even urine because, in a nutshell, what's more efficient than charging people to pee? Let's start with a well-known urine tax. People collected human urine from public urinals and fullers' workshops. This was then used as a source of ammonia to bleach clothing and tan leather. So, when Emperor Vespasian realized that this bodily product could be used as a chemical, he did what any responsible emperor would do. He made the collectors pay taxes. The phrase, "money doesn't stink," is used to say that money is not bad. Pecunia non let was born when his son Titus asked if it was right to attack people like that. Vespasian gave him a coin and asked if it smelled. It didn't. I understand what you're saying, but that's just the start of the problem. In ancient Rome, there was a tax on windows to encourage people to build more modestly. If you owned a slave, you also had to pay a special tax. Inheritance taxes could also reduce the amount of money you left behind. There was even a sales tax, but only for free citizens. If you were a slave, that's good news. You were already considered something that could be taxed. Tax collectors were called publicani, and to be honest, not many people liked them. These middlemen paid the state in advance for the right to collect taxes and then asked citizens to pay as much as possible to make a profit. They were like a private collection agency, but for the ancient world. If you don't pay, soldiers might come to persuade you. Despite this, Roman taxes paid for some amazing projects like aqueducts, roads, temples, and military conquest that stretched the empire from Britain to Syria. Some people think that Roman taxes helped to build civilization, but others think they destroyed it. And yes, there were tax revolts. The provinces were unhappy about having to pay taxes, and more than one rebellion started with the words, "How much?" In the middle of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire had one of the most detailed and organized systems of paying taxes in the world. And no, it wasn't based on gold or coins. It was powered by cocoa beans, jaguar pelts, and feathers so fine they made European kings look underdressed. The Aztecs had a different system of taxation. It was known as tribute, and it was similar to a giant imperial wish list. The emperor didn't need your permission. He needed your region's best products to be delivered regularly and without excuses. Every city, state, or altar petal, a territory controlled by the Aztecs, had to send tribute, which was carefully recorded by scribes known as calpixa. These men carried detailed lists showing what people owed. It's pictures, not numbers. Piles of maize, stacks of cotton, bundles of obsidian, and yes, sacks of cocoa beans. Imagine a picture of an invoice that looks like it's from the underworld. Cocoa beans were especially valuable. They were used as food and drink and as money. A small group of people could buy a tamale, a cloak, or a night out at the local human sacrifice. They were so valuable that people tried to make copies of them and fill them with dirt. It was brave, but also a crime that could be punished by death. The IRS of Tenochtitlan was very strict. Tribute items could be anything from delicious turkeys and honey to decorative jade gold dust and giant logs that had to be carried from forests miles away, which were very inconvenient. One province had to make and deliver embroidered warrior costumes regularly. The costumes also came with sandals that were ready for battle. Another specialized in exotic bird feathers, which were used to make headdresses for nobles and gods. Imagine trying to explain to your village why you have to pay 30 live parrots and 2 jaguar pelts in tax. Sorry kids, Jaguar is chasing day again. If you don't pay, there could be violent consequences. Aztec tax collectors weren't shy, and rebellious provinces were often met with military force. Following the rules was important for survival, not for helping the community. Even though the conditions were very difficult, the tribute system made the empire successful. The capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of floating gardens, gleaming temples, and markets bursting with goods, much of which was paid for by the towns that paid taxes to the capital. In ancient China, taxes were more about how much money the government collected, not about punishing people or strange goods. With a population of tens of millions and an empire that seemed to go on forever, China built a huge bureaucracy to collect taxes. It was so big and precise that it would make Roman senators weep into their wine. Let's start with the basics: rice and labor. During the Han Dynasty, peasants were the economic backbone, and they paid taxes in 3 main ways: grain, cloth, and corv labor. The grain filled the granaries of the empire. The cloth was given to government officials. The workers had to leave their homes for weeks or months at a time. They worked on canals, roads, and sometimes on the Great Wall. Imagine it's tax season, but instead of paperwork, you're moving bricks through the government. As the empire grew, so did its taxes. The Tang Dynasty introduced a 2-tier tax system to make things easier. It required 2 payments a year, one in the summer and one in the autumn. The amount you paid was based on how much land you owned and how many people you had eating your rice. In theory, it was fair. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of what was fair. Then the salt tax was introduced, and the empire grew. Instead of everyone paying the same tax, the government decided to tax salt, something everyone needs. Everyone needed it, especially before we had refrigerators. And so the state made a lot of money. For hundreds of years, money from salt sales was used to pay for armies, palaces, and the pensions of government officials. It's not an exaggeration to say salt was very important in the history of the world. But taxation wasn't just about raising money. It was about control. Census taking was almost an art form, as were land surveys and household registries. The goal was to know exactly how much rice you grew, how many sons you had, and whether you were hiding a second ox behind the barn. But it wasn't all perfect. One of the main reasons why peasants started rebelling was because they were being taxed too much. This was true of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which happened in the late Han period. When farmers are starving and still being asked to give 30% of their rice, bad things tend to happen. Long before modern accountants started asking for your W-2s, ancient Mesopotamians were already inventing the art of taxation using clay tablets, reed styluses, and no room for creative deductions. The first tax system was created in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was created by the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. It was also around this time that people started to make complaints about taxes for the first time in history. Instead of using paper, they used soft clay to keep their tax records. These tablets, thousands of them, documented everything from how much barley was given to how many animals were counted. If you think your local tax office is slow, try waiting for your grain levy to be logged by a man scratching symbols into mud. The main tax is barley. In early city-states like Uruk and Lagash, farmers paid some of their harvest to the temple or palace. The temples weren't just religious buildings. They were busy places where money was being handled, with people there who worked for the government, rooms for storing things, and priests who were surprisingly strict. But grain wasn't all that was needed. The Mesopotamians taxed fishermen based on how much they caught, traders based on the goods they sold, and craftsmen based on how much their workshops produced. Even donkeys were targeted. If you had a donkey or a cart that you could use, that was great. You were now a small business that was subject to tax. Under the Babylonian king Hammurabi, taxes became more organized. His famous legal code, which is one of the oldest in the world, set out punishments for not paying taxes, overcharging officials, and cheating the system. In some cases, the punishment wasn't just a fine. It was a choice between death and being cut into pieces. So, if you ever feel like your modern tax form is tough, remember that at least it doesn't come with the possibility of amputation. One special thing about taxes in Mesopotamia was that they were linked to building public works like roads and bridges. Citizens might pay taxes in the form of bricks, silver, or labor, helping to build things like canals, ziggurats, and city walls. If you couldn't pay with goods, the state could take your time or your children's time. There's no better way to teach your kids about money than by having them help out at the temple for a while. But even though it was old, the Mesopotamian tax system was very efficient. It helped manage cities that were growing, fund water systems, and support armies. In other words, it stopped the whole operation from falling apart. In ancient Greece, taxes were more about getting the money to the government than about keeping order. Unlike more centralized empires like Egypt or China, many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a mix of civic pride, social pressure, and well-dressed tax avoidance strategies. Let's start with the basics. People were rarely taxed directly. Athenian citizens didn't pay income tax like we do today. Instead, they were expected to contribute to the state through church services. This means, hey, rich guy, it's your turn to pay for a play, a worship, or a festival. These weren't technically taxes, but try saying no and still being invited to dinner. But foreigners and medics who lived and worked in Athens did pay taxes. They had to pay a monthly protection fee to be allowed to live in the country. Basically, thanks for living here. Now cough it up. Trade was another way to make money. People brought goods into and out of the busy port of Piraeus, and Athens made sure to take its share with customs taxes, tolls, and docking fees. You could tax things like olive oil, wine, or pottery, but not ideas. These ideas came from philosophers who also had strong opinions about taxes. Plato believed that rulers should be modest and serve the state, not make money from it. Aristotle, who was a realist, thought that taxes were necessary for running a country. However, he said that if taxes were too high, people might start to rebel. Meanwhile, the average Athenian just wanted the tax collectors to stay away from their grape harvest. This is the real problem: tax farmers. Instead of collecting taxes themselves, Greek states sold the right to collect taxes. The person who bids the highest would pay the state in advance, and then get the money back, plus more. These tax farmers were very unpopular. Even though there was a lot of chaos, the system worked more or less. Taxes paid for temples, wars, roads, and democracy itself. But people, especially the poor, got angry and sometimes even took legal action or left the country. Welcome to the Inca Empire, where you didn't pay taxes with money or cocoa beans. You paid for it with your hands, feet, and back. The Inca was one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas. It was spread across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. and they did it without coins, markets, or written language. So, where do they get the money from? The tax system is based entirely on labor, and it is known as the mitar. The mitar wasn't a suggestion. It was a required part of state service. All able-bodied men had to spend some of their time working for the empire. They usually spent this time building roads, farming state land, mining silver, or hauling stones for temples and fortresses. Imagine the Inca tax form as a calendar, not a bill. The best thing about the mitar system was how well it worked. Instead of everything being based in one place, the empire was broken up into thousands of local communities called Alice. Each sent its workers when the empire asked for them, and in return the empire provided food, tools, and access to communal storehouses. You gave your time and got survival. Do you need a bridge over a mountain gorge? The mitar provided. The cities of Cusco and Machu Picchu need to be connected by hundreds of miles of paved road. Mita, do you want a huge stone temple that weighs as much as a bus? Yes, that too. But the taxes didn't stop at muscle. People were also expected to grow crops on state-owned fields, raise llamas for transport, and weave cloth for the military and aristocracy. Some areas were known for growing maize, potatoes, or making textiles, which were then traded. The empire stored these goods in huge warehouses called cocas. These were built along important roads so that they could be easily accessed in times of famine or war. The Insur were different from other ancient civilizations because they did not use tax collectors in the traditional sense. Instead, local leaders kept knotted cords called quipus. These were used to track workers and how much was produced. They didn't need writing when they had the world's most complex tax system made of string. And yes, there was resistance. After the Spanish arrived, they forced the Mita to work in the mines, which quickly became very hard and even deadly for them. In the past, people worked together to pay taxes. But this became a problem during the Islamic Golden Age. This was a time when the empires of the Middle East, North Africa, and some parts of Europe had some of the best ways of collecting taxes in the world. This was better than the way Rome did it. But unlike earlier models of raw extraction, Islamic taxation came with a moral philosophy, religious duty, and careful record-keeping. Zakat was at the center of it. It is a religious tax and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It wasn't just a donation. It was compulsory. Muslims were expected to give around 2.5% of their wealth every year to help the poor, people who were in debt, and travelers who needed it. It was a tax to promote social justice, not to fund palaces or armies. Imagine it's the first time money was shared out, but with God watching. But zakat was just the start. There was also the carriage, a land tax paid by non-Muslims who farmed lands captured during wars, and the jizya, a tax paid by non-Muslims in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. These taxes weren't random. They were officially defined, based on wealth, and often negotiated between communities and rulers. Non-Muslims could keep their religions and local customs as long as they paid on time. To manage all this, the caliphates developed a professional class of scribes and accountants. They kept records in Arabic writing, tracked markets, and issued receipts. The diwan, or state treasury, was not a chaotic pile of coins, but a centralized bureaucracy with trained officials and standardized forms. Imagine Excel spreadsheets, but on parchment paper. One special thing about Islamic taxation was its connection to market regulation. Officials known as muhtasibs walked around markets to make sure prices were fair, goods were weighed correctly, and people behaved fairly. If you try to hide your profits to avoid zakat, the muhtasib might come with a scale, a stern stare, and possibly a citation from the Quran. And while corruption wasn't unknown, there were regular audits and people were held accountable. Some rulers, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, were known for walking around in disguise to check that taxes were not making life too difficult for ordinary people. In many ways, taxes in the Islamic Golden Age balanced making a profit with being religious. It built schools, hospitals, and libraries, and it encouraged a lot of new ideas that had a big effect on Europe for hundreds of years. In medieval Europe, paying taxes was less about doing the right thing and more about surviving feudal extortion without losing your limbs. While kings and nobles thought they had the God-given right to demand taxes, it was the ordinary people who felt the pain of every coin, chicken, and piece of hay being taken away to pay taxes. The most well-known medieval tax was the tithe. This wasn't something the state made you pay, but a mandatory 10% of your income that you had to pay to the church. This meant that a tenth of your crops, livestock, or fish would be given to the local monastery. Did you not want to pay? You weren't just avoiding taxes. You were risking being sent to hell forever. It's hard to disagree with a tax that's backed by the threat of hellfire. Then came the feudal dues. If you were a peasant, you basically paid your lord to let you live. You paid for the land you farmed, for the mill you used, for the oven where you baked your bread. Have you got married? That was a fee. Did you inherit your father's field? Another fee. I had a really good harvest, so I'm sure the tax man will come to my door with a share of the harvest and a list of new charges. After the Norman conquest, taxes in England became more organized and scary. The Doomsday Book, which was put together under William the Conqueror, with a huge list of information about who owned what, including how many pigs you had hiding in the back garden. It was basically a scope for a tax sniper, and no one could escape being seen. By the 13th century, kings had found new ways to raise money, especially for war. In France and England, kings and queens started to charge people direct taxes on income and property. But with the central government came resentment. People often hated tax collectors more than enemy armies. And when the government oversteps the mark, rise up and fight back. The English peasants revolted in 1381 because they were being forced to pay a lot of tax. Everyone pays the same amount, no matter how much money they have. It was like charging a lord and a farmer the same amount and expecting no one to notice. Spoiler, they noticed. Taxation in medieval Europe was very difficult. It was enough to pay for castles, cathedrals, and crusades, but not so much that people got angry and started attacking. Taxation in ancient times was about more than just the economy. It could be as simple as using cocoa beans or rice, or as complex as using people as forced labor. It was about power, control, and the delicate relationship between rulers and the people they ruled. One coin, one grain, one revolt at a time. For the Vikings, death was not the end. It was simply the start of a new journey. Life was short, difficult, and cruel. But death was where the real adventure began. How you live your life, or more importantly, how you die, affects where you go after you die. The most desirable afterlife was Valhalla, a golden hall of Odin where slain warriors gathered to eat, fight, and prepare for Ragnarok, the end of all things. To get to Valhalla, you had to die in a battle. It was better if you died doing something brave and violent. If that wasn't on the menu, there was still Folkvanger, the realm of the goddess Freya, who got to choose first from the fallen. People think her hall was just as good, but with fewer head injuries. But not all souls went to the warrior paradise. Those who died from illness, old age, or without enough energy were said to drift to hell, a dark place ruled by the goddess of the same name. Contrary to popular belief, hell wasn't a place of punishment. It was more like a calm, relaxed afterlife, maybe with fewer drinking horns and battle songs. Viking funeral rites were carefully planned performances. They were a way to honor the dead and provide guidance for the living. A funeral that was done well showed respect, wealth, and high social status. A funeral that was done badly did not. That was a recipe for bad things to happen, like being haunted, getting bad luck, or even worse, a soul that is wandering without rest. These funerals weren't about finding closure. They were about making sure that people's deaths were respected and that they were remembered. Even the most simple funeral might include food, weapons, and personal belongings to help the dead on their journey. And for the Norse elite, they weren't subtle. Chieftains, warriors, and nobles often had grand funerals involving ships, flames, burial mounds, animal sacrifices, and entire ceremonies performed with great precision. The idea was to honor the dead and make sure they were remembered. In Viking culture, if you were remembered, you lived on. The funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was the first page of the afterlife. In Viking society, people didn't just bury their dead in a pit and forget about them. They were prepared carefully with attention to detail and a little bit of theatrical flair. If death was a journey, then the dead person needed to be dressed like a traveler and packed like one too. When someone died, their body was washed, combed, and dressed in their best clothes. This wasn't about vanity. It was a symbol. Keeping things clean was a sign of respect, and nice clothes made sure that the dead person was taken care of properly. A chieftain might be lying on a thick woolen blanket, his cloak trimmed with fur. A shield maiden might wear embroidered dresses adorned with brooches and beads. Jewelry wasn't just for show. It was all about her spiritual side. Weapons were very important. A warrior might be buried with his sword, axe, or spear, along with a shield. These weren't just for show. They were real tools for the afterlife. If you're going to fight all day in Valhalla, you'd want your favorite sword with you. Even ordinary people were sometimes buried with knives or simple tools, suggesting that it was important to have useful things as well as to have a high social status. The dead were also given grave goods: drinking horns, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead. It's as if they were getting ready for a very long trip with a few snacks and some entertainment. These objects were used for practical, religious, and sentimental reasons. In some cases, they were deliberately broken before burial, which may have released the object's spirit for use in the afterlife. Social rank was very important. The more important the person is, the more elaborate the preparation. There are records of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters, but this was rare and usually only happened for important people. It was brutal, yes, but in Viking belief, it was an honor to go with your lord into the next world. After the body was prepared, it was laid out for a while so that the community could mourn, reflect, and say goodbye. This was also when the religious ceremonies would really get started. People pray, chant, and tell stories to remember the dead. For the Vikings, preparing the dead was not seen as a sad task. It was an act of love, respect, and responsibility for the universe. They weren't just dressing a dead body. They were preparing a soul for the journey beyond. When most people think of Viking funerals, they imagine a ship on fire as it sails towards the horizon, carrying a warrior to Valhalla. It's a well-known image in popular culture. It's dramatic and a bit unrealistic. But how accurate was it? The short answer is partly true, partly a poetic license. The Vikings were very familiar with ships. These weren't just ways to get from one place to another. They were symbols of power, status, and life itself. For seafarers, warriors, and nobles, the ultimate farewell was to be buried on a ship or even with part of one. It was a symbol of going back to nature, to the gods, or to the exciting journey ahead. But most Viking funeral ships were not set on fire and pushed out to sea, as many people think. That image is probably a mix of medieval myths and 19th century romantic paintings. The truth is, full ship burials were rare and expensive. When they did happen, the ship was usually placed on land. The body and other belongings were put inside the ship. Then the whole structure was either buried under a mound or set on fire in place. One of the best-known examples is the Oserberg burial found in Norway. It contained a beautifully carved ship with two women in fancy clothes inside, surrounded by fabrics, sledges, and animal sacrifices. No hard feelings, just respect for the land and the history of the area. Another example is the Gstad burial, which included the body of a chieftain, his weapons, tools, and even sacrificed horses. Once more, there is no water, no fire, just honor and craftsmanship. But there were cremation burials involving boats or symbols of boats. In some regions, smaller boats or boat-shaped outlines made of stones were used in cremation ceremonies. The pea was built directly on the ship. These events were amazing, but they were also very simple to organize. Burning an entire boat took a lot of wood, space, and it made me very nervous. The fire wasn't just for show. In Viking beliefs, fire purified the soul and was sent up to the gods in smoke. It also stopped the dead from coming back as restless spirits, which was a very real fear in Norse mythology. Viking funerals weren't just solemn affairs. They were investments in the afterlife. The dead weren't sent off empty-handed. Instead, they were filled with grave goods. This spiritual starter pack is designed to make you feel comfortable, give you status, and help you survive in the next world. Let's start with the most important things. Vikings were buried with tools, weapons, and personal belongings, no matter what their status was. A man might be buried with his sword, axe, or bow. A woman might have keys, brooches, weaving tools, or even cooking pots. These weren't just small symbols. People thought they were used by the soul after death in the place it was going to. No matter where you were going, it was always a good idea to be prepared. The rich got more elaborate funerals. Some burials include drinking horns, board games, imported silks, musical instruments, and even carts or sledges. One woman in the famous Osberg burial was buried with a fancy wagon, 5 carved animal heads, and lots of textiles, enough to open a shop selling clothes in the afterlife. But what made Viking funerals different was that they sacrificed animals. Horses were common in burials of the rich, showing status and power. Archaeologists have found graves with multiple horses. The horses were arranged carefully and clearly sacrificed for a special event. Dogs, hawks, and even oxen also make appearances, each probably chosen for specific spiritual or symbolic reasons. Sometimes, sacrifices went beyond animals. If a slave or servant was killed, they might be buried next to their master. This wasn't just a joke. It was seen as a way of showing loyalty or service. But from a modern point of view, it's really bad. Some stories, like that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, talk about shocking rituals where a slave girl was killed in a religious ceremony to go with a chieftain into the afterlife. The girl thought that, in death, she would continue to serve him. Everything put in the grave, whether it was alive or not, had a purpose. The Vikings believed that the soul needed support, just as it did in life. Grave goods were gifts, supplies, and protection that were meant to show status and functionality across the cosmic divide. In Viking culture, death didn't just mean that a person died. It left a big mark on it, and you could often see that mark for miles. Go inside the burial mound, or Hogar in Old Norse. A hill was built to honor the dead and their social standing. These weren't just piles of dirt. Viking burial mounds were deliberate monuments built with care. A chieftain's mound might be raised over a buried ship or wooden chamber. This would be filled with grave goods and sealed with layers of stone and soil. Some were covered in turf, a type of grass, to blend with the landscape. Others left raw and stony as a permanent message to the living. Someone important is buried here. The size of the mound was important. A bigger mound means a bigger legacy. These weren't just graves. They were status symbols, visible signs of a family's power, wealth, and ancestry. Sometimes, Mounds were arranged in patterns that formed shapes or lines up with celestial events. Vikings were practical, but they were also deeply symbolic. These mounds were also used by the community. They became special places where people remembered and told stories. Families might gather there for special events, meals, or important promises. The burial mound was a connection between people who were alive and those who had died. Sometimes, they didn't just bury one person. A mound might have more than one grave inside it, added over time. This can turn a single burial into a monument that represents a whole dynasty. This meant that land was not just occupied by the living. It was claimed by the dead, shaping who they thought they were and how they remembered them for centuries. Not all Viking burials were as grand as this one. Most people might have simple graves or stone circles, especially in places where it was hard to build mounds. But even these had care. This includes things like grave goods, cremation remains, and orientation with the sun or stars. It was a reminder that even in a simple death, the Viking spirit wanted to have a purpose, to burn or to bury. That was the Viking funeral dilemma. The answer to this question depended on where in the world you were, what your social class was, what era you were talking about, and what you believed. Modern depictions of Vikings often show flames and fire, but the truth is more complicated. The Vikings often used both cremation and burial, often in the same communities. Let's start with cremation. In the early Viking periods, especially in Sweden and some parts of Denmark, most people chose to be cremated. The body would be put on a funeral pyre with grave goods around it and set on fire. The fire was not just destruction. It was like a spiritual release, like purification. The smoke rose and carried the soul to a place that might be Odin's or another world altogether. When the fire had gone out, the ashes and burnt bones were collected carefully and either put in an urn or scattered in a grave lined with stones. But cremation wasn't just about reaching the gods. It also had practical uses. In places where there was not much space or where wild animals could threaten graves, it made sense to use fire. And let's not forget the emotional side of things. Cremation made sure that the dead couldn't come back. Norse myths are full of restless spirits, undead warriors, and revenants. If you turn a body into ashes, it is less likely to haunt you. As time went on, especially in the late Viking Age, more and more people were buried. This was especially after Christianity became more popular. Burial was more in line with Christian beliefs about the afterlife and the preservation of the body. But even before Christianity, some Viking communities liked to bury their dead in chambers, ships, or wooden coffins. The body would be laid out in full dress, surrounded by goods, animals, and tools. Interestingly, both methods often existed together. A chieftain might be cremated on a pyre while his wife was buried nearby, or cremation might be used for warriors while burial was used for farmers and traders. The choice could be based on personal identity, social class, or regional custom. Both rites were united by their attention to detail and respect, whether they were turned to smoke or buried under a mound. The Viking dead were treated with respect by travelers heading into the next world, however they chose to get there. Viking funerals were not quiet affairs. They were traditional send-offs full of song, storytelling, toasts, and symbolic actions. Treating the body physically, like burning or burying it, and loading it into ships was very important. But the rituals of the living were just as important. To die well was one thing, but to be remembered properly, that was what made you an immortal. Viking funerals were often accompanied by songs and poetry. Skalds or poets were very important in making sure that people remembered the dead. They wrote poems about people's good deeds, family history, successes, and even their strange habits. These verses weren't just sad. They were amazing and made the dead look like heroes from stories. If you weren't sung about at your own funeral, did you even die a Viking? Funerals also included a ritual where people would toast. This is called the minne. People passed around drinking horns, and everyone gave a toast to honor the dead, the gods, their ancestors, and fate itself. These were serious times, but also important for community, mixing sadness with friendship. It was grief expressed with firelight and fermented honey. People made offerings at the gravesite, like food, weapons, and blood. Animals were sometimes sacrificed at funerals. This was thought to help the dead person's soul in the afterlife. These rituals were often led by a priest or priestess who dressed in a Goth style. They conducted ceremonies with chants, symbolic gestures, and possibly some magic words that could not be printed. In richer funerals, there were special performances. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat from the 10th century, wrote about the funeral of a chieftain. This chieftain was probably a Norse settler who lived near the Volga River. The funeral involved days of preparation, animal sacrifices, and the ritual killing of a slave girl who volunteered to accompany her master. Although it is scary by today's standards, it shows how important death rites were to the Vikings, both in their religion and in theater. Finally, people could hold memorial feasts weeks later. These events are used to settle business, share possessions, and honor the history of the family. New leaders might be chosen, promises made, and tales retold. For the Vikings, death wasn't just a loss. It was a story to be told, a song to be sung, and a life to be celebrated with fire, singing, and drinking. As the fire consumed the body and the song carried the soul, the stone preserved the name. In Viking society, memory was very important. It was carved into the earth. And so the runestone was created, one of the most long-lasting Viking traditions. Runestones weren't gravestones in the modern sense. You weren't putting a small marker next to a plot of land. You were building a public monument that people could see, read, and respect. These stones were put along roads, near bridges, at crossroads, and beside burial mounds. They showed the life and legacy of the dead. The inscriptions were written in runic script, an alphabet used across the Norse world. Some were easy. Gunnar raised this stone to remember his brother. Others were very long stories about voyages, battles, and brave deeds. Some of them even included curses for anyone who dared to deface or move the stone. If you move this stone, you'll have bad luck. The Vikings were very serious. Many stones were dedicated to warriors and chieftains, while others were used to remember merchants, travelers, and even women. A famous example is the Jelling stones in Denmark. King Harald Bluetooth had huge stones put up to remember his parents and say that Denmark was now a Christian country. They combine old pagan traditions with new Christian influences, showing how runestones changed over time. Carving a runestone was expensive. It needed someone who knew how to use runes, time, and a big piece of stone, usually granite or sandstone. But the reward was everlasting life. Raising a runestone was a way of saying, this life matters. This person will not be forgotten. Even hundreds of years later, their words are still heard. Some runestones had images, ships, weapons, animals, or symbols of power on them. Others were more abstract, twisting runes into snake shapes or dragon curves. The way it was presented was as important as the message. In a world where stories were passed on by voice, the runestone was a physical anchor, a clear reminder carved into the world itself. The Vikings were strong and brave, but they had one final fear that no amount of fire, stone, or sword could fully eliminate: the dead who wouldn't stay dead. In Norse beliefs, not all spirits left peacefully. Some people stayed a little longer, some came back, and some didn't want to leave at all. These were the Draugr, restless dead, who rose from their graves with bloated bodies, glowing eyes, and a very bad attitude. They weren't airy ghosts. They were real people, dangerous and mean. They were known for being so angry that they could crush bones, break doors, and sometimes sit on sleeping people like a heavy rock of vengeance. It's like a Viking horror movie, but you might actually know the guy from your village. What makes someone a dragger? It's either a bad death or a bad life. People who are greedy, violent, or dishonest were the best candidates. The same was true for those who had unfinished business. People get angry for many reasons, like jealousy, revenge, or because they owe someone a favor. If you don't do it properly, it could make the dead person unhappy. If the burial wasn't done properly, or if the grave goods were stolen, the dead might come back to check. Viking funerals included protective rituals to stop this from happening. Sometimes the bodies were buried with heavy stones placed on top to literally pin them down. Other graves show signs of being pierced with spears or stakes, which is a good idea if you're trying to avoid being bitten. When a person was cremated, their body was burned completely. This was done not only to make the body pure, but also to destroy the form that the spirit could take on again. But not all of the ghosts were bad. Some were ancestral spirits that offered guidance or watched over family lands. These spirits were known as Filier or Disir and could be protective if treated with respect. People often gave them gifts and said prayers for them at burial sites. Even in the afterlife, there was still tension. A warrior's soul might spend forever fighting in Valhalla, which sounds great until you realize it's a constant war with no weekends off. The Vikings believed that even after death, there was always a struggle. But death is more than just the end. It was a beginning, a warning, a haunting, and a story. The dead were never fully gone. They lingered in smoke, in song, in stone, and sometimes in footsteps you didn't expect to hear behind you.